I've always loved libraries. There's something comforting about the quiet, the rows of books, and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But after what happened that night, I'll never be able to set foot in one again. It was a cold, rainy evening when I decided to visit the old library in my town. It was one of those places that had been around forever, a relic from a time when people still cherished the smell of old books and the feel of paper in their hands. The library was set to close in a few months, and I wanted to visit it one last time before it was gone for good. The place was practically deserted when I arrived. The librarian, an older woman with silver hair tied in a bun, greeted me with a nod as I entered. She was the only staff member there, and I could see she was eager to close up for the night. I gave her a polite smile before heading to the back of the library, where they kept the older, less read books. The deeper I ventured into the library, the more I noticed how eerie the place felt. The rain tapped against the windows like nervous fingers, and the sound echoed through the empty aisles. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I found myself in the history section, leafing through an old book about local legends. The stories were interesting enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, but each time the aisles were empty. Shrugging off the unease, I continued reading, losing track of time. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustle of clothing. It came from somewhere behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just rows of bookshelves, the spines of ancient tomes staring back at me. I was about to dismiss it as my imagination when I heard the sound again, this time closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, just the same unsettling silence. I could feel my heart rate start to pick up as I slowly began to back away from the shelves. I decided I had spent enough time in the library for one night. Closing the book, I started making my way back to the front desk, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. My footsteps echoed in the empty space, and I couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, was following me. As I reached the main aisle, I heard the sound again, this time unmistakable. It was the creak of a floorboard, just a few feet behind me. I spun around, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow dart between the shelves. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen, my eyes scanning the darkened aisles. I wanted to call out for the librarian, but my voice felt trapped in my chest. The library, which had once felt comforting and familiar, now felt like a maze of hidden dangers. Gathering my courage, I started walking quickly towards the exit, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the aisle, was a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that blended almost perfectly with the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, blocking my path. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unyielding. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I turned and bolted down a side aisle. My only thought was to get away, to find another way out. But as I ran, I could hear the soft, steady footsteps behind me, following me through the labyrinth of bookshelves. I zigzagged through the aisles, desperately trying to lose whoever, or whatever, was chasing me. But no matter where I turned, the footsteps were always right behind me, growing louder, closer. In my frantic state, I stumbled into the children's section, where the small, colorful chairs and low shelves felt grotesquely out of place in the midst of my terror. I ducked down behind one of the shelves, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. For a few agonizing moments, everything was silent. I dared to hope that I had lost the figure, that maybe it had gone the other way. But then I heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps entering the children's section. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, my mind racing for a way out. But the only exit was back the way I had come, where the figure was now standing. I could hear it moving closer, its steps slow and methodical, as if it knew exactly where I was hiding. I peered through the gaps in the shelves, trying to catch a glimpse of my pursuer. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a pair of dark, polished shoes stop just a few feet away. The figure was standing right there, on the other side of the shelf, separated from me by only a few feet of wood and paper. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the figure paused, as if listening for any sign of movement. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. But then, to my horror, the figure began to bend down, as if to look through the shelf and see me crouched there. Just as the figure's face began to come into view, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed one of the books from the shelf and hurled it in the opposite direction. The book hit the floor with a loud thud, and the figure immediately turned towards the sound. Taking advantage of the distraction, I bolted from my hiding spot and ran back towards the main aisle. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind me, faster now, more urgent. I didn't dare look back. I raced towards the front desk, my eyes locked on the exit sign just beyond it. But as I neared the desk, I realized with a jolt of terror that the librarian was nowhere to be seen. The front door was locked, and the keys that should have been on the desk were gone. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for another way out. That's when I noticed the side door, usually used only by staff. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of hope in the nightmare I was living. I dashed for the door, praying that it wasn't locked from the outside. Behind me, I could hear the figure closing in, its footsteps echoing in the empty library. My fingers fumbled with the handle as I threw the door open and stumbled out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like they would give out at any moment. When I finally dared to look back, the library was just a dark silhouette in the distance, and there was no sign of the figure. Shaking, I pulled out my phone and called the police, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. They arrived quickly, but when they searched the library, they found no sign of anyone. The librarian was found in a small office at the back, unconscious but alive. She had been attacked, but couldn't remember by whom. The police told me later that the security footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, just me wandering the aisles and then suddenly running out in a panic. No one else was seen on the tapes. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that library with me. All I know is that I'll never go back. Some places, once tainted by fear, can never feel safe again.
I'm Ashley, a junior in college, and a self-proclaimed bookworm. I'd always loved the quiet solitude of libraries, but what happened one night made me question ever setting foot in one again. It was midterms, and the pressure was intense. The library was my sanctuary, a place where I could drown out the noise of campus life and focus. I found a quiet corner on the third floor, far away from the usual study spots. It was an older part of the library, filled with dusty books that probably hadn't been touched in years. The perfect place to study in peace, or so I thought. I settled in, spreading my notes across the small wooden table. The only sounds were the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the library would be closing in an hour. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. As I dove into my textbook, I heard a faint sound, like a soft whisper. I looked up, but no one was there. I shook it off, figuring it was just the old building settling. But then, I heard it again, a little louder this time, almost like my name being called. Ashley! My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around the empty rows of books, trying to rationalize the sound. Maybe someone was on the floor below, and their voice was carrying up through the vents. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The voice was too close, too clear. I packed up my things, deciding to move to a more populated area. As I stood up, I noticed a book lying on the floor a few shelves down. It hadn't been there when I first sat down. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to it. The book was old, with a worn leather cover and no title. I picked it up and a chill ran down my spine. The pages were filled with strange symbols, and as I flipped through, they seemed to shift and change before my eyes. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and a shadow passed in my peripheral vision. I spun around, but again, no one was there. Panic set in. I dropped the book and bolted for the stairs, As I reached the stairwell, the lights went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the pitch-black void as I made my way down the stairs. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me, growing more urgent with every step. I reached the second floor, but the exit was nowhere in sight. The library felt like a maze, twisting and turning with each corridor leading me deeper into its depths. I was disoriented, terrified, and the whispers kept calling my name. Finally, I saw a faint light ahead, a small reading room I'd never noticed before. I ran towards it, hoping to find another exit. But as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The room was lined with shelves, filled with books just like the one I had found earlier. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices echoing off the walls. I backed into a corner, my heart pounding, as the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. They swirled around me, forming dark, faceless figures that crept closer and closer. Just as they were about to engulf me, the door burst open and a security guard rushed in, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadows vanished instantly, and the whispers stopped. The guard looked at me like I was crazy, asking what I was doing there after hours. I stammered out an excuse, grabbed my things, and fled the library without looking back. The next day, I returned to the library during daylight, determined to make sense of what happened. But the reading room was gone, as if it had never existed. The shelves were back in their usual place, and the old book I had found was nowhere to be seen. I never studied in that part of the library again, but the whispers still haunt me. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I'm certain that some secrets are meant to stay buried in the stacks.
It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to stay late at the campus library. My name is Lily, a junior in college, and with midterms looming, I needed the extra time to study. The library, usually bustling with students during the day, had an eerie calmness at night. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustle of paper or the distant hum of the air conditioning. I chose a secluded corner on the second floor near the philosophy section, where I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. Time seemed to blur as I buried myself in my textbooks, the world outside fading away. Hours passed, and soon I was one of the last students left. I glanced at my watch. It was nearing midnight. I debated heading back to my dorm, but decided to stay a little longer to finish the chapter I was on. The library had a rule. All students must leave by 1 a.m. I figured I had plenty of time, so I pushed through, determined to make the most of the quiet. As I continued reading, I noticed something strange. A figure moved in the reflection of the window across from me. It was faint, barely noticeable, but enough to catch my attention. I quickly turned around, but the aisle behind me was empty. Just my imagination, I whispered to myself, shaking off the unease. I returned to my book, trying to focus, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Every so often I'd glance up, scanning the empty library, but nothing seemed out of place. Around 12:30 a.m., I decided to take a break. I gathered my things and headed to the restroom. The hallway leading to the restrooms was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly. As I approached, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I stopped and turned, expecting to see another student, but the hallway was empty. A chill ran down my spine as I quickened my pace. The restroom door creaked as I pushed it open, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I splashed some water on my face, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. When I looked up into the mirror, I saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the restroom, her face obscured by shadows. Her clothes were tattered, and her hair hung limply over her face. "Hello?" I called out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she began to move towards me, her steps slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me as I backed away, my heart racing.
I stumbled out of the restroom, slamming the door behind me, and ran back to my study spot, my mind racing. I grabbed my bag, determined to leave. But as I hurried towards the exit, the lights in the library began to flicker violently. The once silent library was now filled with an eerie, low humming sound that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves. I could feel a presence behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the main staircase and bolted down the steps, my footsteps echoing loudly in the vast, empty space. As I reached the ground floor, the humming grew louder, almost deafening. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft, shuffling, getting closer. I ran faster, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The exit was just ahead, the large wooden doors that led to freedom. But as I reached out for the door handle, the lights went out, plunging the library into complete darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but my hands were shaking too much. The footsteps were right behind me now, the presence so close I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. In a desperate attempt, I swung the door open and ran outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I didn't stop until I was halfway across the quad, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally looked back, the library stood silent, its windows dark. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I made it back to my dorm, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I told my friends what had happened, but they laughed it off, saying I was just overtired. But I knew what I saw. The library had never felt the same to me after that night. I later learned that the library had a history, one that the school didn't like to talk about. Decades ago, a woman, a former student, had taken her own life in that very restroom. Since then, there had been stories, whispers of strange occurrences late at night, but nothing concrete. I never stayed late at the library again, and every time I walked past it, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, waiting.